So, inshallah, we'll get to our class going back from the beginning of the Quran through as far as we can make it, inshallah. Line by line, word by word, whatever it takes to understand the Quran. So, last week we talked about the phrase Alhamdulillah, which is often translated as all praise belongs to Allah. And we analyzed that in some detail. But just as a reminder of what we talked about various verses in the Quran where the phrase Alhamdulillah comes at the end of something, like the completeness or the end of something. Not just the end of the verse, but the completeness or the end of a situation. So, for example, when he talks about the companions of Jannah, he says, وَآخِرُ دَعْوَاهُمْ أَنِ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. For example, we talked about this verse in chapter 10, verse 10, that the end of their call is Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, right? And we talked, excuse me, we talked about some other verses, for example, where he says, فَقُطِعَ دَابِرُ الْقَوْمِ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Like when his punishment was complete for those who did wrong, and they were completely قُطِعَ, all of their traces were completely cut off. He ends that by saying, وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. So these are just a couple verses to review that we talked about last week. But the idea was that we saw several verses where the phrase Alhamdulillah comes at the end of something or in the completion of something. So from that, we derive that part of the meaning of Alhamdulillah has something to do with acknowledging the completeness of Allah's system of how He does things, right? That it's complete and interconnected and perfect and perfected. And what we're trying to do, why does the Quran start off in the first couple verses with Alhamdulillah when it seems like it's something that comes at the end or the completeness? Why doesn't it come at the end of the Quran? Why does it start right at the beginning? Because perhaps, as we talked about last week, it relates to something like the Buddhist saying that they have, begin with the end in mind. So we're beginning with this idea of Alhamdulillah, this completeness that Allah has placed in His universe, and then we're trying to actualize that and live according to that. So now, today, we want to talk about the phrase Rabbil Aalameen. So Rabbil Aalameen is often translated as the Lord of the worlds. So we want to discuss this in a little bit of detail. What does this phrase actually mean? Rabbil Aalameen, that we translate as the Lord of the worlds. So this word Al-Alameen is an interesting word, and it has a lot of potential interpretations. In fact, some people believe that there are 10 different interpretations at least for this word. There may be more, there may be less, but there are definitely quite a few different interpretations for this word. And that's because when it's used in the Quran, when you look at it in different verses, it opens up the possibility that it could refer to different things, especially from the wording itself. So the wording of Al-Alameen itself comes from the root Ain, Lam, and Mim, or what we could roughly say with English letters is A, L, and M. Although the Ain in Arabic isn't exactly A, but roughly, for those who might not know Arabic. So that root word, though, is the same root word that we use for knowledge. So knowledge in Arabic is ilm, okay? Ain, lam, and mim, it's the same root. And also, we would say, like, for example, alam. Alam means like a sign of something. So when you have a sign of something, we can call that in Arabic alam. So why is alam and ilm, why are those two words related? Why is the word for a sign of something and knowledge related? It makes sense if you think about it. Alam, a sign of something, is something that gives you knowledge of something else. It's a sign that gives you knowledge of something else, right? So how does that relate to the word alameen? That's why there's different interpretations of it, because when you go back to that root word and you ask yourself, how does that relate to knowledge, right? And that's how does it relate to the translation that we normally find, which is worlds, like Lord of the worlds. Al-Alameen are the worlds, right? So how do you relate those things together? So that's what brings about a lot of different possible interpretations of this word. And to be quite honest, I feel like I'm still in the process of studying it. I don't feel like I've came to a firm conclusion, although I have some observations and ideas I want to share with you today. But there's a few verses where personally I'm not completely satisfied that I understand why it's used in these verses. So, for example, in the story of Lut, just to give you one example, his people tell him, أَوَلَمْ نَنْهَكَ عَنِ الْعَالَمِينَ. Did we not forbid you, like when he entertained guests, did we not forbid you from al-alameen? Why did they specifically, right, use the word al-alameen? Why didn't they say أَوَلَمْ نَنْهَكَ عَنْ النَّاسِ, for example? Why didn't we forbid you from people? Or didn't we forbid you from people, I mean, right? Instead of al-alameen. So why did they specifically use this word? So this word is used in a few verses that, for me personally, I'm not completely convinced that I understand the reason why it's used. Another one, for example, just give a couple examples. So another one is about the ship of Noah. He says, and this is in chapter 29, verse 15, he says, فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَأَصْحَابَ السَّفِينَةِ وَجَعَلْنَاهَا آيَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. He said, so we saved him and the companions. See, there's that word, Aziz, there's that word companions. وَأَصْحَابَ السَّفِينَةِ فَأَنْجَيْنَاهُ وَأَصْحَابَ السَّفِينَةِ. We saved him and the companions of the ship. وَجَعَلْنَاهَا, and we made it, meaning the ship, ayatan lil-alameen. We made it a sign for al-alameen. Okay? Now, that's interesting because in other places in the Quran, when he talks about making something an ayah or making someone an ayah, he says, وَلِنَجْعَلَكَ آيَةً لِلنَّاسِ, and that we make you an ayah for people, an-nas. But with the ship of Nuh here, he says we made it an ayah for al-alameen. Okay? So I'm just giving a couple examples just to show why personally I'm not completely convinced that I understand why al-alameen is used in some of the verses that it's used. And to me, that shouldn't be a discouraging thing. That should be an encouraging thing that inspires our curiosity, because I think that's how the research of the Quran should go. No one should, I feel, believe that they have everything about the Quran figured out. And sometimes when you're studying the Quran, it's like putting together a puzzle. So you get pieces of a puzzle here, pieces of a puzzle here, and you start to put it together, and some of the pieces start to come together. So what I researched for today, for our class today, specifically for the phrase Rabbul Aalameen, I believe are some pieces of the puzzle, right? But I also believe there's something deeper to this word al-alameen in the Quran that we still need to uncover, some layers that we still need to uncover. And so what shows that, though, and that's why I wanted to mention these verses, is because you see when you start to dig into it, and you, even if you go to the books of tafsir, if you go to what different classical scholars have said about it, you see different possible interpretations for it. And all these interpretations you can pretty much summarize into two main strands or threads, and then these can be further subdivided. But just to give you an idea of what you find for the interpretation of this of this word. So one strand of interpretation is going to interpret al-alameen as meaning all of creation. And that's why sometimes they translate it as the worlds, right? Another strand of interpretation is going to interpret al-alameen as specific rational beings. So it's going to interpret it not as all of the worlds, but or all of existence or all of creation. It's going to interpret it, this strand of interpretation is going to interpret al-alameen as referring to specific rational beings. Rational meaning, conscious, sentient beings, basically. So then where the difference is going to come in that strand of interpretation is what specific rational beings then is it referring to. So some are going to say it refers to people, human beings, and jinn. Some are going to say, add the angels in there. Some are going to argue that it only refers to human beings and jinn because in some verses of the Quran, for example, in 25:1, it refers to the Prophet Muhammad by saying, تبارك الذي نزل الفرقان على عبده ليكون للعالمين نذيرا. That blessed be the one who sent down Al-Furqan upon his servant so that he could be a warner for Al-Alameen. So they argue from verses like this that the Prophet Muhammad was a warner for Al-Alameen. So therefore it's specifically, who was he a warner for? He wasn't warning the angels, he wasn't warning other things, he was warning specifically, if you look in the Quran, human beings and jinn, however you interpret those particular categories. So that's an argument from that perspective, right? So this is why you find a lot of varied perspectives about it, because when you look at some of the verses, you can see different possible ways to think about it. So those are basically, to sum up all the different interpretations of this word, those are basically the two main strands of thought that you're going to find. It's either going to be all of creation, or it's going to refer to specific sentient or rational beings, and then they're going to differ about what rational beings they refer to. And also this relates back to the root of the word alameen having to do with knowledge. So how do we interpret that? What is the aspect of knowledge with al-alameen? So some people are going to say that why whatever al-alameen refers to, whether it refers to all of creation or whether it refers to specific rational beings or sentient beings, some are going to say the reason that they're called al-alameen, related to the word for knowledge, is because everything gives you knowledge about Allah. Everything will guide you to thinking about Allah, right? And that could be part of the interpretation. But it also, if we think about it deeper, what if it refers to all creation? And I'm going to give you some verses that supports that in a very strong way, because there are actually very specific definitions of Rabbul Aalameen in the Quran. So this phrase, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Aalameen, this last part of the phrase, Rabbil Aalameen, the Lord of Al-Alameen, there are some very specific definitions for that phrase in the Quran that, in my very, very, very humble opinion, support the view that it refers to all of creation. So if that's the case, how do we understand this word being connected to knowledge? And this word possibly seems like being a plural. Okay, so that's another aspect of analyzing this word. So al-alameen, if you break it down to the singular for the word is alam, alam, alam. Okay, that's the singular for a world. Basically, we could roughly translate it. And when you add the een part on there, alameen, that becomes plural. That's why they say worlds, right? So if alam and alameen, so if alam is the singular and alameen is the plural, and alam is connected to knowledge, what does that mean? That there are many different worlds, for lack of a better translation, that relate to knowledge. So these points bring up a lot of interesting things that I think need to be studied about this word. And I think there's many more layers that could be explored about this word. But it brings to mind a lot of different possibilities. For example, the possibility of the multiverse. We know this is something that is talked about in physics and science, the possibility that there are multiple universes, so the multiverse. So could it be referring to something like that, where there are sentient or rational beings, not just within our universe? Another possibility that it brings, at least to my mind, is there are some theories in the study of consciousness. So when you study consciousness, this is one of the things that in our time, this is one of the aspects of science that is hotly debated, and it is a subject of ongoing research. Is what exactly is consciousness? How do we become conscious? What is it? And so there are a lot of different ways to look at it, different theories, but there's one theory that's called panpsychism. So panpsychism basically is the idea that everything on some level is conscious, right? So one of the ways that they think about that is if you think about what makes you conscious, right? So your brain basically is the seat of your consciousness, which is made up of all these individual neurons, which is made up of, if you keep going down, is made up of atoms, etc. So your brain, the seat of your consciousness, is made up of the same components that makes up everything else in the world, as far as like atoms and stuff like that. So the argument from this line of thought is that because your brain is made up with the same materials that make up other things on an atomic level and a subatomic level, so therefore, because your brain is conscious, all these things that make up your consciousness are conscious in a certain way that perhaps is beyond our current understanding. So that's called panpsychism, the idea that everything in the universe is somehow conscious. So that's an interesting line of thinking when you think about this word al-alameen. If it refers to all creation, does it refer to some kind of knowledge that exists within everything? So those are some thoughts to begin our study with. To say why I think that I don't really feel personally that I have a complete understanding of this word. But this phrase Rabbul Aalameen. So the word Al-Alameen occurs 73 times in the Quran, and either 41 or 42 times. The reason I'm saying either because I counted them first and I got 41. But then as I was researching it, I ran across another study and they said 42. But I think they made a mistake. But because I didn't go back and recount, I'm gonna say either 41 or 42 just to be on the safe side. But then I can go back and recount. But I think I know which one they included that doesn't actually say Rabbil Alameen. But just in case I'm wrong, I can say 41 or 42. So if we think about it like that, the word Al-Alameen occurs 73 times in the Quran, either 41 or 42, so well over half, right? Because even if it's 42, if it's 41, that's going to bring us 32 times that it doesn't say Rabbil Alameen. So well over half of the times that the word Al-Alameen is mentioned in the Quran, it's mentioned in connection or in conjunction with the phrase Rabb, or the word Rabb, to make this phrase Rabbil Alameen, or the Lord of Al-Alameen. Now, the surah that this phrase Rabbil Alameen is mentioned the most in is Surah 26. Okay, so Surah 26, the phrase Rabbil Alameen, out of the 73 times that Al-Alameen is mentioned in the Quran, and out of the 41 or 42 times that the phrase Rabbil Alameen is mentioned, the surah that mentions the phrase Rabbil Alameen the most is Surah 26, Surah Ash-Shu'ara. So, in my opinion, that would be a good starting place to understand what is the significance of the phrase Rabbil Alameen, because it's mentioned the most in that particular surah. So obviously there's like a heavy emphasis on it. So I think the surah as a whole, if we want to dig further into this, should be analyzed and studied with that in mind. I didn't have time to study the surah as a whole, but I brought some verses from that surah that I think really interestingly define the phrase Rabbil Alameen. So let's start with the first, not the first place it's mentioned necessarily, I don't think, in that surah. Let me see. Yeah, it's around the first place it's mentioned. Yeah, it is actually the first place it's mentioned. So 26:16 is going to be where we're going to start. So 26:16. So the first place it's mentioned in this surah is in verse 16, and it's mentioned in reference to Musa going to Fir'aun. So what I want you to notice too is there's another interesting observation that I found in studying this phrase, is that this phrase has a very heavy emphasis in the stories of both Musa and Ibrahim. Okay, so that's another interesting thing to unpack and to think about. Sometimes for me personally, this is what happens. Sometimes when I'm studying anything from the Quran, oftentimes there's so many details, and I end up finding so many different observations that need to be followed. Like every one of these observations can be studied and followed on its own path, and that's probably going to lead you to other discoveries. And sometimes it's just not possible time wise to follow every thread, every observation. However, I think it's good for us to talk about them because someone else might remember something. Like I might have made this observation, but I might miss a point that connects that observation to something else. So at least if we mention the observations, if someone remembers something that will help us tie it together with the whole idea, or that might spark someone's curiosity and they might follow that thread. So just like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village for us to study the Quran because there's just too much to unpack. So that's an interesting thing that I want us all to think about. And over time, another thing about making observations, right? So I'm sharing some of this because I like to share not just conclusions from the research that we're doing, because the conclusions are what they are. They're there are theory of how to tie things together as we're learning and as we're studying. That doesn't mean we reach the final result. More importantly, I think, is that we share methods of study. Okay, that way we become more independent in our study, and we can go to the Quran. We can start to study it for ourselves because we're starting to develop the tools, and not just we're not just being told. Because usually, in a lot of classes or a lot of different instruction environments, what's happening is you're just being told this is the information, this is the answer. You're not really being taught like how to think about things, how to reason through things. So I like to share sometimes different methods and different tools for studying the Quran for all of us to develop more independence in our study. So the reason I said that is because the importance of making good observations. Another thing about that is sometimes we discard our observations because we don't know what the conclusion is. So we make an observation, and the first thing we're saying to ourselves is, okay, well, why though? And then it feels like it's kind of useless because I don't know why it's like that. But that's the starting point. Making a good observation or making good observations when you study the Quran is extremely important, because what I've experienced myself many times is that I'll make certain observations about the Quran, and then it'll be like 2 months later sometimes, and I'll come across another piece of information. So I don't know what to do with this observation at the time that I make it. But 2 months later, I come across another piece of information, or someone says something, and it sparks my mind, and it just connects that together. So as you study the Quran, don't always focus on the conclusion. Focus on making very good and accurate observations. And then I promise you, inshallah, if you do that over time, the conclusions will come naturally. The good observations are the gateway to the beneficial conclusions, I really believe. So this observation that Rabbil Aalameen, this phrase Rabbil Aalameen, is very heavily emphasized in the stories of Musa and Ibrahim. Not that it's only used with them, but in this chapter, this is what I want you to notice. In chapter 26, the phrase Rabbil Aalameen is mentioned the most in this chapter, right? And in this chapter, we find a very heavy emphasis on discussing what exactly is Rabbil Aalameen from the perspective of Musa and from the perspective of Ibrahim. So I think that's a very important observation to think about. So here in the beginning, Allah is sending Musa to Fir'aun. He says, قَالَ كَلَّا, he said, nay, فَذْهَبَا بِآيَاتِنَا, go with our ayat and our signs. إِنَّا مَعَكُمْ مُسْتَمِعُونَ, we are with you listening. فَأْتِيَا فِرْعَوْنَ فَأْتِيَا فِرْعَوْنَ, then go both of you to Fir'aun. فَقُولَا, and you both say to him, إِنَّا رَسُولُ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ, that we are the messenger of Rabbil Aalameen, of the Lord of Al Alameen. Okay? Now look at this. This is so beautiful. So, and then the verses continue, verse 17. And arsil ma'ana bani Israel. Tell them to send, and arsil, tell him to send with us ma'ana bani Israel, the children of Israel. Now, look at Fir'aun's response to this. This is beautiful. In verse 18, Fir'aun says, قال ألم نربك فينا وليدا ألم نربك فينا وليدا. So Fir'aun responds by saying, did we not raise you amongst us as a child? But what's the word that can be translated as raise you? Nurabbika. We raise you. Nurabbika. Does that sound familiar? Because it's from the same word, same root word as the word Rabb. Nurabbika. Rabb. Rabb al-Alameen. So Allah first tells them, Musa and Harun, go and say to him, Inna Rasulu Rabbil Alameen. But Fir'aun says, Alam nurabbika. No, we rubbed you, in other words, right? We were the Rabb for you. But Allah is saying, no, you go tell him that you are the messenger of Rabbil Alameen, the Rabb of Al-Alameen. We're going to come to a definition of that, hopefully, in a minute, right? So I don't think, again, that's a coincidence that these words occur like that. Because the word Rabb also means, in Arabic, Rabb is the one who yurabbi, meaning develops you, cultivates you, nourishes you, helps you grow. And that's why this is a word that is actually used, the same root word is a word that's used to describe our parents. In Surah Al-Isra, it says, وَقُلْ رَبِّ ارْحَمْهُمَا, and say, my Lord, have mercy upon them, كَمَا رَبَّيَانِي صَغِيرًا, just as they رَبَّيَانِي, as they raised me, grew me, developed me, صَغِيرًا, as a small child. So these words are related. The word Rabb and the idea of yurabbi or tarbiyah, or development and nourishment and growing and raising. So then, if we skip a little bit, because there's a discussion, we come back to Fir'aun in verse 23. Fir'aun specifically asks Musa, قال فرعون وما رب العالمين. Fir'aun says, and what is Rabbul Aalameen? So, here we go. Here we go, right? Musa says, what is Rabbil Alameen? Or, I'm sorry, Fir'aun says, what is Rabbil Alameen? So Musa is going to give us a definition. So, in the very next verse, 24, قَالَ رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا إِن كُنْتُمْ مُوقِنِينَ. He said, the Lord of the heavens and the earth and what is between them, if you are amongst those who have certainty. So that would seem, and Allah knows best, but that would seem to me to be a very straightforward version of the phrase, or not version, definition, I meant to say, of the phrase Rabbil Alameen. Right? Because Musa, or Fir'aun asked him, وَمَا Rabbul Alameen? What is Rabbul Alameen? And Musa responded, رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا. The Lord of the heavens and the earth and what is between them. So this is one of the arguments, and I think it's a very strong argument actually, of people who say Al-Alameen is everything, is all creation. So then that brings us back to what we started from in the beginning, asking, well, how then does that relate to the idea that Al-Alameen is from the word for ilm, or related to the word ilm, meaning to have knowledge? And then that's when we can go into some of the possibilities that I mentioned earlier. But let's continue, because Musa didn't stop defining Rabbul Alameen with just this phrase. So Fir'aun responds by saying, قَالَ لِمَنْ حَوْلَهُ أَلَا تَسْتَمِعُونَ. He said to those around him, are you listening? In other words, like maybe like mocking him or something, or like, you hear this guy? You hear what this guy's saying? أَلَا تَسْتَمِعُونَ. Aren't you listening? And then Musa continues, قَالَ رَبُّكُمْ وَرَبُّ آبَائِكُمُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. He said, your Lord and the Lord of your آبَائِكُمُ الْأَوَّلِينَ, your earlier, your previous fathers, your predecessors, your Lord and the Lord of the people that preceded you. So Fir'aun responds, قال إن رسولكم الذي أرسل إليكم لمجنون. He said, the messenger, your messenger who was sent to you is crazy. He's crazy, right? But what another, there's so many different layers when we talk about the Quran that we could look at. So another thing that I want to mention about this is notice how Musa doesn't allow himself to get distracted by what Fir'aun is saying. Right? Notice that Musa stays on track and he doesn't respond to the personal insults that Fir'aun is directing towards him. Right? Because Fir'aun first starts off by saying, وَمَا Rabbul Aalameen? What is Rabbul Aalameen? And Musa answers him. And then he says, you hear this guy? And then Musa doesn't get caught up into that. He doesn't say, what do you mean, do you hear me? Was I not speaking clear? Like, he doesn't get into the back and forth with Fir'aun. He just continues. قَالَ رَبُّكُمْ وَرَبُّ آبَائِكُمُ الْأَوَّلِينَ. He said, your Lord and the Lord of your previous your predecessors, your previous forefathers. قال إن رسولكم الذي أرسل إليكم لمجنون. He said, your messenger, truly your messenger that was sent to you is crazy. And then Musa just continues. قال رب المشرق والمغرب وما بينهما إن كنتم تعقلون. He said, your Lord, he said, the Lord of the East and the Lord of the West and what is between them, if you have intelligence. In kuntum ta'qilun. Okay? So, look at how Musa, even when he was called crazy, didn't respond to that. He just kept mentioning the points. He stayed on track with the points, right? But all of this is Musa's definition for Rabbul Aalameen. When Fir'aun asked him, وَمَا Rabbul Aalameen? What is Rabbul Aalameen? He said, the Lord of the heavens and earth and what is between them. He said, the Lord of your Lord and the Lord of your previous fathers. He said, the Lord of the East and the Lord of the West and what is between them. So that would seem to lend strength to the idea that the phrase Rabbul Aalameen is Al-Aalameen here is referring to all things, all of creation. Another place here in chapter 26 that's going to give us a really nice definition of Rabbul Aalameen. This phrase Rabbul Aalameen is with Ibrahim. So when Ibrahim talks about the things that his people are worshiping besides Allah, so he says, Qala, this is in 26:75. He says, Qala afara'aytum ma kuntum ta'budun. He says, do you not see what you used to worship? Antum wa aba'ukum al-aqdamun. You and your previous fathers. See how the discussion relates? It's very similar because Musa referred to Rabbukum wa Rabbu Abaikum al-Awwalin, your Lord and the Lord of your first fathers. And here Ibrahim refers to what they used to worship, Antum wa Abaukum al-Aqdamun, right? You and your fathers al-Aqdamun, from previous generations, or those that have passed. فَإِنَّهُمْ عَدُوٌّ لِي إِلَّا رَبَّ الْعَالَمِينَ. For they are enemies to me except for Rabb al-Alameen. Now he's going to define exactly from his viewpoint what is Rabbul Alameen. He says, الَّذِي خَلَقَنِي فَهُوَ يَهْدِينَ. The one who created me, so he is the one who guides me. وَالَّذِي هُوَ يُطْعِمُنِي وَيَسْقِينَ. And he is the one who feeds me and gives me to drink. وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينَ. And when I am sick, then he is the one who cures me. وَالَّذِي يُمِيتُنِي ثُمَّ يُحْيِينَ. And he is the one who causes me to die and then brings me to life. وَالَّذِي أَطْمَعُ أَنْ يَغْفِرَ لِي خَطِيئَتِي يَوْمَ الدِّينِ. And the one who I hope will forgive me of my sins on the day of judgment. رَبِّي هَبْ لِي حُكْمًا وَأَلْحِقْنِي بِالصَّالِحِينَ. He says, My Lord, grant me judgment and join me with the righteous. So look at Ibrahim's definition of Rabbil Aalameen. He says they are all everything that you worship is enemies to me except for Rabbil Aalameen. And he defined it as the one who created me and guides me, the one who feeds me, gives me to drink, the one who cures me when I'm sick, who brings me to life after death, and the one who I hope will forgive my sins. That's how Ibrahim understood Rabbil Aalameen. So when you look at Musa's definition in the same chapter, that's why it's so significant, I think, because it's in the same chapter, which is chapter 26, and it's the chapter that mentions the phrase Rabbil Alameen the most, is chapter 26. And then you look at Musa and you look at Ibrahim. Musa defined Rabbil Alameen in a universal sense, in a very comprehensive sense. The Lord of the heavens and earth is what is between, the Lord of you and your fathers that preceded, the Lord of the east and the west, and whatever is in between, right? So he defined it in a very comprehensive, universal way. Ibrahim defined Rabbil Alameen in a very personal way, right? It was all about the one who created me and guides me, and the one who feeds me and gives me to drink, and the one who cures me when I'm sick, the one who brings me to life after death, and the one who I hope will forgive me my sins. Okay? So, from these two definitions, beautiful definitions in Surah Al-Shu'ara, we can have the feeling of when we say in Surah Al-Fatiha, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, we can have the feeling that the phrase Rabbil Alameen is the most comprehensive and universal and simultaneously the most personal. That it refers to the one who is the Rabb, the one who yurabbi, the one who cultivates and develops and nourishes and sustains everything, the heavens and the earth and what is between, the east and the west and what is between, you and everyone who preceded you. We can have this comprehensive version of Rabbil Alameen, universal thought process about Rabbil Alameen, while simultaneously feeling a very personal connection as defined by Ibrahim when he said he's the one who created me and guides me and feeds me and gives me to drink, and when I am sick he cures me, and when I die he gives me life, and he's the one that I hope will forgive me. So in the phrase Rabbil Alameen, we find the most universal and the most personal. And it kind of reminds me of another way to think about it is when you think about how we explore the universe around us, we use different tools to augment our personal senses because our personal senses can only take us so far. So we use a telescope to go as far out as we can, and we use a microscope to go as far or as close or as far inward as we can. So we either go really far out or we go really close in. And I feel like the definitions of Musa and Ibrahim remind me of that. That in the definition of Musa, we're looking through a telescope at the most broad way of thinking about Rabbil Alameen. And in the definition of Ibrahim, we're looking through a microscope at the most personal way of thinking about Rabbil Alameen. And Allah knows best. That's our class for today. I'm gonna stop a little early. It was only 45 minutes, but because we have the live at 2, so I want to give a couple minutes to transition between those. And also, if anyone has any questions or thoughts that they wanna mention. Is everybody good? Well, I'll take that as being a yes.
Hey, all good here.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Well, as always,
I had recitation going while you were teaching, so this was just like chef's kiss. This was awesome. Thank you
Alhamdulillah.
so much.
Alhamdulillah. I'm glad for sure. As always, man, I'm so glad everyone made it. I'm so glad we were able to have our class. I enjoy these classes. I learned a lot in preparing for this class. That's why I always say one of the biggest parts of being a student for me is the aspect of teaching, because in teaching you have to learn in order to be able to give it. In trying to prepare and think about what is the significance of this phrase, Rabbul Aalameen. I found some things in the research that I never contemplated in the 30 plus years of being Muslim. So I really appreciate you guys. I really feel like you guys coming here for these classes and the other classes that we do are really giving me an opportunity to do something really beneficial for myself and for others. So I tell you guys this all the time, but I really mean it. I really appreciate you guys. So with that, we'll close, and I'll see, for those who can make it, I'll see you in about 10 minutes on TikTok. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.